Well, welcome to episode 10 of About Performance, the Lives of Actors. My name's Dr. Mark Seton, and it's great to have you with us again for this episode, which I've entitled Acting Has It All Been Worthwhile? And my special guest today is Dr. Anne Pender. But before we go into the program proper, just to remind you that we hope that you are following the ongoing conversation using the hashtag #LivesOfActors. And you can also follow me and the work that I'm doing around the health and wellbeing of actors on Twitter through @SenseConnection. That's connection with an X. As I say, it's great to have you here, and I'd like to now introduce you to Dr. Anne Pender. Welcome, Anne.
Thank you, Mark. Good morning.
Good morning and good evening to those in other parts of the world. And you're the Associate Professor of English and Theatre Studies at the University of New England and an ARC Future Fellow. And I know that this chapter that we're going to talk about today is drawn from your larger research. Perhaps you might like to say a bit about that before we start exploring the chapter.
Yes, I'm currently engaged in a large research project looking at the lives of a large group of Australian actors, most of them born between 1930 and 1950, but not all. And I'm interviewing them. I do long, lengthy biographical interviews about their lives and their work. And the emphasis is on the changes that have occurred in their lifetimes, in their careers, and their contribution to Australian theatre over the last 50-odd years. Most of them have worked on stage, some of them did radio, most of them have also worked on television and film.
So it's a really rich collection of these interviews that you're collecting. It's a very exciting project.
Yes, it's a very large project. It's a very interesting project because it is based around the actor's own view of their work and their role in the theatre. It's very much centred on them. And then the aim is to write a biography with biographical profiles of each of the actors and to get their interviews and their visual materials up onto a site. So I'm collaborating with the National Museum of Australia as well on that side of it.
That's terrific. So it's such an important work, and it has a certain responsibility attached. In fact, at the beginning of your chapter, you talk about citing Inga Clendenin. She writes that writing biography can be morally, socially, and legally dangerous. Could you tell us a bit more about why is biography such a risk-taking venture?
Well, it is difficult and dangerous because you're entering into the private world of somebody else, and there is a lot of potential for damage if there are revelations about their private life or the lives of their close family and friends that really they do not want revealed. So there's always a danger of hurting somebody. So you've got to tread very carefully, but you still also have an interest in discovering the truth about somebody's life, the truth as they see it and also as you see it. So you're negotiating those viewpoints and you're trying to get a sense of the history of their life and their contribution in amongst a whole lot of other lives. So there's a sort of moral danger that you might transgress, you might do something that is wrong and hurtful, that you might get sued. And also there's a sense, I think, out there, even among scholars, that biography is somehow prurient and not as respectable as other fields of history or literary studies. So even amongst, the collegial world, the academic world, there's a view that it's somehow a little suspect. So there are these difficulties around it. But the main ones are those moral ones of negotiating with the actual subject. What is it that they want told of their story, and what is more difficult and cannot be told.
And there's also what I appreciate about that also is you're recognising the interconnectedness of the person as actor in relation to the other persons in their lives. So often my experience of the way in which the media reports the lives of actors is that they are either isolated from all those others that they have important, long-going relationships with, or they then get pulled into the vortex of media exploitation or voyeurism that can then again distort the reality of the relationships that are important and ongoing beyond the actual professional life of this person.
Yes, and my interest is very much in the life of the actor, so not simply the career. I'm interested in their origin, their family of origin, their training, and what they did. But I'm also interested in the person beyond the career, because the two are so integrally, mixed. So you can't actually divide it, but that is sometimes very difficult because of privacy. And often we all know that we don't always feel comfortable talking about our lives and our close relationships. But biography must try to, I think, discover the life, not just a set of achievements or a career trajectory or a trainer, and then how that influenced the person in their performing life. It's more than that, but that's where the difficulty lies.
Yeah, and also one of the values, though, of this project strikes me is that also you are looking at the lives of Australian actors, which is often something that's neglected by, well, other cultures because they'll look naturally to American actors or English actors. How important was that for you to look at Australian actors?
All important. I'm very interested in Australian actors because they have made such a contribution to our cultural industries over the last 50 or 60 years. It's a moment in history. Before that, many of our actors were really forced to go to the UK to work because there just weren't the opportunities here. But the actors in this study came along at a time when all of that was changing, all of it was opening up. So they were able to work predominantly in Australia. So suddenly careers could be made here, and that was partly because theatre was changing, expanding, opening up. Television was beginning, a film industry began. So the opportunities were enormous, and the actors have been incredible in that period. We have had a real flowering of our industries in that period. So I really wanted to look at what Australian actors had achieved. There's another reason too, and that is that our theatre histories of the post-war period have concentrated on playwrights pretty much. And there's a reason for that, and that's important, very important scholarship. It's important to look at the work of playwrights, the interpretation of plays and the movements, the currents in playwriting. But it's also very important to look at the performers and what they bring to drama. And so the study sort of proceeds from the idea that an actor really should drive a production, obviously with respect to the text and in close collaboration with the director, etc., but that an actor has a lot to bring, and that our recent history, this 50 years, shows that without some of these particular actors, we might not have had the stellar, exciting drama on the stage and on television that we have had. So it proceeds from a number of different standpoints or ideas, I suppose.
So in this particular chapter that you've contributed to our publication about performance, you look specifically at the lives and the careers of two long recognised actresses, Elspeth Ballantyne and Julia Blake. I wonder what would be some of the challenges of the biographical interview that you ensured it was both ethically respectful, but also that it was insightfully honest, because in your chapter, you want to hold that tension of being ethical and respectful, but also insightful and honest. How did you negotiate that?
Well, one of the things I think that's important is in the method. Obviously, approaching the actors and asking if they want to be part of it is the first thing, and these two agreed. It's very important, I think, although I go along to the interview with a whole lot of questions that I would like answered, that I don't necessarily impose those questions, that I seek to have the subject determine the way the interview goes and to sort of take control of it, to tell their life story. So there's a sort of willingness and encouragement on my part for them to do that. And most subjects, I have to say, do that and do it well and very willingly. And then they are kind of owning the life story. They're giving me their sense of themselves and their life without me having to try and force things and force them to discuss things or to say they don't want to discuss things. So that's a kind of methodological technique, I suppose, although I do have loads of questions, specific questions there if I need them, and we sometimes go to those later. So that's one thing. And simply also to reassure the actor that afterwards they will be able to see what is written. They can see transcripts if they wish to. Often they don't need to do that or don't want to do that, but they can, and that they will look at finished material before anything is published. They check it, they can ask for things to be removed. So those sort of reassurances are made. They're the main things, but it is about trying to encourage them to talk about important moments of their life as they see fit in their view. And that usually works very well. I've been really struck by the sort of candour, I suppose, of the subjects in this study, and particularly the ones who are in this chapter, Elspeth Ballantyne and Julia Blake.
And with these two interviews, you were looking at, I think, what you talk about, their personal, their material and their artistic stresses and their challenges throughout their career. Was this something that you felt could be more readily accessed from actresses rather than actors, or is it something you were equally able to solicit, you know, the personal, the material and the artistic from both actors and actresses? Was there a difference, or?
There are a lot of men in the study, and they also talk a lot about those three areas. So it's not a huge difference, though it's fair to say that I think all of the men in the study were in partnerships, marriages when they were raising children, whereas Elspeth Ballantyne happened to be alone at one point raising children, so it was particularly difficult. I think the women, maybe because of the generational circumstances and situation, the age range of these actors, feel that, you know, very much motherhood is a very big responsibility, as all women do. So perhaps they were a bit more forthcoming about how they felt. But certainly all of the people in the study talk about personal, artistic and material stresses. So I wouldn't want to make too much of that. Yeah. But these particular actresses were very forthcoming about motherhood and its stresses.
And you also note the importance of the value of having both empathy for them, but also maintaining a critical distance in the interviews and also in the writing process. And I found when I was reading that sort of resonates very much with what actors are often, or suggested actors need to do when they're creating character, to empathise with the character they're playing, but also to keep a critical distance. Did you find yourself making these kind of connections, and did your interviewees appreciate this dynamic of empathy yet critical distance as you were doing the interviews with them?
Yes, and I think it is one of the joys of this project with actors. They understand it at a very profound level. And so they're extremely good informants about themselves and about other people. So it's one of the strengths, I suppose, of actors, that they can do this. They can see themselves very honestly and speak about themselves very honestly. They can also look at themselves with a bit of distance. So that they were incredibly helpful to me in this regard. They are, amazing at being able to give observation, but also to have some distance on their own lives. So yes, it's a connection that I made, they made, and they were just fantastic at doing that. They are really profound observers of themselves and others. So this wasn't so much of a problem with actors, because they're so good at it. They're so attuned, and they're so articulate as well, generally speaking, about themselves, and very honest and humble in some ways. So they're compelling as biographical subjects.
I must say I share just a little bit of that experience with you in my participation doing the survey of actors' health and wellbeing, because we invited responses, qualitative responses to questions as well as quantitative. So we're inviting them to tell us stories, to share aspects of their lives, in a sense, in an anonymous way, of course, with us, and with the appropriate ethical protocols, of course, for research. And so, yes, I really connect with you that I must say I was very moved by the honesty and the vulnerability, not surprising, of actors, but to really say what they were struggling with. They were not trying to sugarcoat it or hide from the internal conflicts that they would face. Sometimes they would recognise and quite powerfully name their own sense of inconsistency within themselves, which is a really vulnerable and honest place to be. So, yeah, particularly, and that's probably a good point to pick up, that one of the things we did find in our survey of actors, which is part of their life experience, were the stresses due to the uncertainty of work or the low pay in work. And you, in fact, note that the greatest stress of trauma the actors described, you said, was this precarious nature of employment and the stress that they experience. How did this theme emerge in the interviews? And were there any new insights that you felt the actors gained through that journey that perhaps we might learn from?
It is certainly a theme of all the interviews. All the subjects discuss that problem and how it affects them, and how it affects them over time, and how it affected them when they started out and through their careers. And, you know, it has to be said that many of the actors in this study are, by any account, hugely successful. But they are still affected by this problem of not knowing necessarily what they'll be doing in a few months or next year, or, you know, maybe even next week. And so they were really insightful and very clear about the way it affected them and how it made them worry, and how it just caused ongoing anxiety and fear, I suppose, and concern that they simply aren't good enough, that they'll never get more work, or so it's just an ongoing source of difficulty for them. They do have insights, I suppose, in that they're just, when they're sort of older and more advanced in their career, they're more accepting of that as in themselves, perhaps. That they know that that's coming. They know they're going to feel anxious, so they can somehow get some distance on it. And some of them have specific techniques for dealing with it that might be around physical health, holidays, breaks, that kind of thing. They know when it really comes upon them, they need to get away, those sorts of things. So they have practical ways of dealing with it, but it doesn't go away, and they're very philosophical about that, some of them.
And part of that frustration and that uncertainty, of course, also plays out in their relationship to those close to them, their family and their friends, who will often say, you know, why do you persist in doing this? Why don't you get a real job? I know this is a theme that came up in your interviews with Valentine and Blake, that there were those around them who questioned at times their wisdom in pursuing such a career. This is that kind of lack of respect, in a sense, for the profession of acting. Are there any things in particular that you might like to give us as examples from either Elspeth or Julia?
Yeah, I mean, sometimes I think that also is born out of actual concern, but misplaced concern by friends. They see the person suffering, so they wonder why are you doing this, not quite understanding that they're kind of driven and they're drawn and that's who they are, and that artistic life is the most important thing in some ways to them. I think also the lack of respect that these particular actors, and one of them talked about, was from other people they're working with. So not necessarily friends and family, but in the actual production, they felt a lack of respect for what they do and their part in the overall production. One of them mentioned the fact that they were simply expected to come in and begin without a read-through of a script, in which they felt they could have ironed out a lot of problems that became very difficult later on. So they see that sort of process as really disrespectful of the actor, who is, in one of their words, I think, the one who has to make the script credible, make it actually work. So if the practical things and some of the aesthetic things are not worked out in that read-through, then that's very difficult for everybody. So that was one, I thought, very concrete example of where an actor felt a disrespect for their contribution. But there were many others to do with practicalities around the set, the design, not being safe. When an actor spoke out about a very uncomfortable and what she thought was a dangerous costume, not listened to, and so had to go on in that costume, broke her leg, lighting being poor around going up very steep stairs. So the enterprise, the practical enterprise, being something that seems to become an obstacle rather than something that could be worked through and the actor listened to before it became a real problem and dangerous for the actor. So those were the sorts of things, are very practical things in some ways.
That's really interesting, because I think that's something I feel we probably under-surveyed in our survey, is we didn't perhaps think to ask where might you be experiencing a lack of appreciation or understanding of the craft or whatever by others. We could almost have it, we might have assumed, I think wrongly, that it came from those who aren't in the industry. But what I hear you saying is this is actually coming from others who actually we would like to think should know better. Yes. The directors, producers, and so on.
And that struck me. I was really struck by that, because I didn't think that's, that was a surprise to me, that they were saying that the people who are, and well-known, experienced people, simply forgetting some of the basics of the collaborative nature of the theatre project, and not listening or not even thinking to listen to what the actor is saying about how this is working or not working in rehearsal and in once the run started on the stage.
And it's even a sense in which, as you say, partly is that willingness or respect of the process of collaboration. So you wonder if some producers or directors actually understand what collaboration is about, rather than I'm the one with the money or I'm the one with the idea and you just do what I tell you to do, and there's not this dialogue or collaboration, conversation. And so I think it's often suggested that, I've come across it, that actors, when they're going through an acting school, a drama school, during those 3 years, they often do experience a lot of rich collaborations, and they almost think, oh, well, that's what it will be like in the industry, and they get a nasty shock when the other players haven't learnt that skill of collaboration. Suddenly they're the lowest peg on the list of consulting and so on. This came up actually in our conversation in this webinar series with Terence Crawford, who identified that often the actor's the last person to be brought into the exercise, where the costumes have already been designed, the set's been designed. There's no sense in which they are bringing something to the table of the creative enterprise.
Yes, and the other side of that has been really interesting too, where a lot of the actors have expressed those things we've been talking about, but then they've also said where the experience has been very positive and where all of those things have been very rich and very productive, that collaborative, and that's always where the actor has been happiest.
Yeah.
In a production where those things were good and sound and they were acknowledged and they were allowed to explore together and all of those things. And that it's incredible how much that comes through and how much the actors will talk about that process and the detail of that and how that allowed them to work to their best. And then they have these, very good memories of those kinds of productions and they want to work with those people again. And so that's been a real feature also, that positive side of the work and that collaborative joy, I suppose.
Yes, and we see that sometimes is played out in the screen production world, where if you look behind the scenes DVD programs, if the actor has had a rich collaborative experience, that is one of the highlights that they will share and talk about, and you really just see the win-win, the outcome for everybody is a great success. So one hopes that others will learn from your writings and from such programs, that actually that's the best way for everybody to win.
Yes, and there's been, they're very good critics, actors of text, but also of set and costume. So they tell you, they're very good at explaining why they think something didn't work and interrogating a process and a production. And that has been really, really interesting to hear their views about what works and doesn't work. And when a set is dominating a production and they feel that has actually crushed something creative or something like that, they're very good at diagnosing. So you think, wow, they listen to more. So that's been a really big dimension of the interviews that talk about the positives as well as the negatives.
Yeah, and that's something that I'd be very interested to see when the book comes out, that this actually makes another important contribution to the way we approach actors as professionals, that we should be giving them far more respect in their ability to be critical thinkers and creative critical thinkers, not just the deliverers of the text or the movers on the stage, but they actually have an aesthetic and awareness and creativity that they bring to the table. So it's
absolutely, yes, and that's very clear in the interviews. Just how much knowledge and how much...
Yeah, sorry, I cut across you. Go on.
Oh, no, just how much knowledge and appreciation they have of drama that really should infuse a production rather than be sidelined or, last on the list. Yeah.
Yeah. So if we take one step back in the lives of these two actors, Elspeth and Julia, how significant and formative was the training in their lives, and what might it mean for other actresses who might follow in their footsteps? So perhaps beginning with how did they train? How was that formative?
Their training was very different. Elspeth Ballantyne was in the first cohort of NIDA when it opened. So her training... Sorry,
we should just note for those watching internationally, NIDA is the National Institute of Dramatic Arts in Australia. So, yes.
Yeah, and situated in Sydney. And prior to that, there were no drama schools, really. There were private coaches and trainers and teachers, and so there was some training available. It's certainly not as it was once NIDA arrived. So it was quite important. Training was very important for Elspeth Ballantyne. She enjoyed the training. She did say to me that she wished she'd learned to sing and dance more so that she was more versatile. But other than that, the training was good in her view. Julia Blake, on the other hand, because she was living in Britain, she didn't come to Australia till slightly later when she married Terry Norris. She trained in Bristol. She did a university degree in drama and French, and then went to the Bristol Old Vic. And she told me that there were some Stanislavski elements in her training. And equally, she found the training absolutely superb. And they both talked quite a lot about their training. But they also talked about the people they worked with after that as being very important the sort of ongoing training that kept going with directors, etc. Elspeth particularly talked a lot about John Sumner and her work with him at the UTRC, that was the Melbourne University Theatre Repertory Company, and how important that was for her in gaining, I suppose, discipline in the craft. But she was very, she got on very well with him. They had a good personal rapport. She found him inspiring in the way he directed. And that was a personal thing, but she learnt a lot in those early years in that company. And Julia Blake talked about a whole lot of directors through her whole career who really influenced her. But the training at Bristol was very important.
So it's very much that initial foundational training, and then the ongoing work with directors, with creative collaborators, in a sense, that really fuels and gives them that ongoing education.
Yes, and I think it was interesting that these two particularly were not necessarily set on entering the profession. They both had a lot of doubts about themselves and not a lot of confidence, I think it's fair to say. And so they really benefited from encouragement from John Sumner, particularly for Elspeth Ballantyne, and other people like I mentioned in the paper, the story she tells about Peter O'Toole coming to see her, Julia Blake, in one of her last productions, and he said, "Well, I hope I see you in the theatre." And she said, "Oh no, I don't think I'm not going into the theatre. I'm not good enough. I'm sure I'm not good enough." And he said, "What do you mean? It's not for you to judge whether you're good enough. It's for others, and you should definitely train, and you should try it, you know." And this speech that he delivered to her, and quite a reprimand, he'd just seen her perform Sally Bowles in I'm a Camera, and he thought she was terrific. And this speech he gave her made her think, "Oh, well, maybe I will." So she did actually then go into the training and at the Bristol Old Vic and made her way. But both of them really had doubts about their level of commitment, I suppose their abilities. They just didn't have confidence, and they sort of didn't really understand what it would mean in some ways, I suppose. So they were both encouraged very much by these two people, and Julia by others as well.
So maybe one of the possible insights we might gain from that actually is also that it's one doesn't just say, "I will be an actor" by themselves, that you actually need those reference points from outside of yourself, of those who have some experience and understanding of the craft and the practice of acting to support and encourage or affirm you in some way. So
I think that's a really good point. It's not necessarily just you and as an individual saying, "I will do this." It's a kind of a social process as well, and you do need that encouragement. And they all talk about their doubts. So while they might have been drawn to the theatre at some level, they certainly couldn't really envisage what the career would be and whether they should go into it. So those reference points were very important. That encouragement, very, very important. That early training experience.
Yeah. I think that's a really interesting outcome of your research so far, that there's that social dimension that is often under-discussed and under-observed, which in a sense what's being drawn out through your biographical investigations, you're pulling that out to the foreground. I think it's very
that's across the board, and so many actors talk about that sort of initial difficulties and doubt. And although they wanted to do it at one level, some of them, they were really tentative, and it was the encouragement of particular teacher, trainer, director that actually got them into it in the beginning, and that was so needed and so valued all their lives since then.
So alongside that social affirmation, I'm aware though there's also the questioning sometimes by others, or perception that acting as a profession lends itself towards being uninhibited. And I was wondering if this observation appeared during your interviews with actors, this either need to be uninhibited or just the attitude of being uninhibited, or were there is that a myth or a stereotype?
No, well, in my view, all of these actors have trained in a time when, you know, losing inhibition was quite a big value in training. And I think they've absorbed it into their very beings. And I think it comes back to them being very good biographical subjects because they are not inhibited about sharing really difficult moments of their life, very honest. So the inhibition on the stage has also somehow informed them as people able to, you know, articulate the problems and challenges of their own lives. So it's very evident to me. I've also worked a lot with writers as biographical subjects, and they're great subjects in many ways too, but they don't have that level of openness, I suppose, and easy rapport that you find in actors. It's a real strength. And I think it partly comes from the training to lose inhibition and to allow yourself to be vulnerable, which is such an incredible thing and so admirable.
Which is really an interesting thing. Again, a part of the strength of the profession is that it actually knows how to nurture something that we at least recognise, I think, appropriately as courageous. This vulnerability, this openness, which some might frame at times negatively as inhibition, because much of our society wants people to be good and proper and inhibited, contained and controlled so that they behave right and they do the right thing. And that's why often the actor historically has been seen as a threat in society, because they say it like it is and they live it like it is, and they seek to be authentic and real in a world that often is about putting on masks, ironically, where and the actor knows that the mask allows them to reveal new things that normally are not socially acceptable.
Yes, definitely. And they tell you also about the arguments and the tensions and the difficulties, because they stand up for themselves frequently, and so they should. But also there's tension, of course, in any group activity.
Of course, yes. So we might look a bit to Elspeth's life specifically, and you may, because I'm aware we've got a sort of international audience watching, you might even want to give our audience a sense of what Elspeth is particularly known for. I'm thinking of her television work in particular, but then maybe that might be relevant to some of her key choices and turning points in the shaping of her career. We might look at that as a starting point.
Yes. Well, Elspeth Ballantyne is best known for her role in Prisoner, the Australian television drama that ran for so long and was one of the most successful television series ever on television, and it still has a huge cult following. So it was a very, very successful drama, and she was in it for, I think, nearly 700 episodes over 7 years.
Wow.
So it was a huge thing, very, very popular. Everybody at the time knew who she was and who that cast was. But the irony was that she trained very much for a classical career. She comes from Adelaide. Her father was Colin Ballantyne, her mother Gwyneth. They were both in the amateur theatre before there were any state theatres, and Colin later founded one of the state theatre companies. So they were theatre people. So she grew up with theatre people all around her. She was in plays as a child in her father's productions. So she really imbibed the theatre very young. But her father had a very strong sense of what theatre was and should be, and it was very much a classical view of things. He thought the future lay in the classical theatre, and that's what he wanted for her. So that's really what she trained for. But then television came along. So she spent these years in the University Theatre Repertory Company, which is a very important precursor to the Melbourne Theatre Company. She did that. She succeeded. She was in the Patrick White plays. She was in Alan Hopgood's early Australian drama. So she was doing very well. But then Bellbird came along, another long-running series, and then Prisoner. She made the decision, because she had children, small children, to go into Prisoner. And that was a turning point for her. And that was largely because of the stress of working in the theatre at night, being away from small children, being on her own, and the difficulties surrounding that. Television made that fractionally easier, given that they didn't film at night. It was daytime, so she could be home with the children in the evening. And that really was her rationale, and that proved to be very effective for her career. She could be home with her kids. So in the time that they were at their critical growing up years, she could be around for them. And that was the decision. She was criticised by people for that in her family and her friends. But for her, it was very important to provide stability and a home life for their children. So that was a big theme of the interview, why she made that decision, what the costs were, but what the pleasures were too of that achievement. And she was one of the best known actors in the country because of that series.
And you also speak in talking about her story, you describe that the social context in which she is seeking employment and acting opportunities is where there's a move from radio through to television. And it seems that she really recognised the need to be adaptable as an actor, as well as the practical considerations of supporting a family as a single mother. How important is that adaptability for her, and do you think it's something that other actors could learn from her experience of?
Yes, look, I think she was very quick to realise and the opportunity of television, but she also was somebody who could make that adaptation quite well and quite quickly. So while other actors might have liked to, they simply weren't taken up by television. They didn't get the roles. They would have liked it. They could see the opportunity, but she did. She was very attractive for television. She was offered a lot of roles. Some other actors actually told me how envious they were of her at the time, that she was able to go into television and to succeed so quickly. But yes, she was really, really smart in the way she took up those opportunities. She didn't demur. She took them, and she was very good at it. She was clever in the way she capitalised on the opportunity, and she was very good on camera. I've looked at a lot of the early television that she was in, and she was wonderful on camera. She made that transition very well, I think. So it's very important for actors to be able to adapt, but not everybody can. So you have to accept that as well, I think.
And this is really probably to acknowledge this is at a time where there's not a lot of formal training, even maybe informal training around acting for screen versus acting for theatre, certainly in Australia at the time. So she's really learning on the job. I
think most of them were. In fact, they say that they were learning on the job about being on camera. There was no training for television. You simply went from the stage, and most of them were doing both. They were working on the stage and they were working on television until bigger contracts like Elspeth's came along, when she had to give up, when wanted to give up the stage for that period. But they were learning as they went. They all say that, and they tell very funny stories about how hard that was and how ridiculous it felt being in front of a camera when you didn't know what to do and all of that. They're very honest about those early years of television.
And you also note that networking and building relationships with other creative peers was a factor that helped her continue to find work.
Yes.
Is this an important theme for our contemporary life as well, do you think?
I think so. And I think she was fortunate in that she had the early years with the John Sumner's company, so she was getting to know a lot of actors. She had that connection to him that was very valuable. And yes, she did make her networks. She made strong relationships, but she was lucky because she was in a company where that was possible, and she had some long contracts there. Yes, networks were very important, as they are for all of the actors, and often sticking with things for, if you can and if you have that opportunity to stick with the same group and play in a company, if that's an opportunity, then a lot of the actors seized that and really capitalised on that.
This is something that actually perhaps makes a little more of a stark difference between those days and what actors these days are able to access, because there are less formal acting companies as such for them to develop those relationships, aren't there?
Yes, and that's why these actors were, in some ways, they were quite lucky to have had those opportunities where there were small companies that were, you know, putting on 8 plays and they were in all of them or most of them. And that was something that it's incredible that we don't have a national theatre ensemble. And that was another reason for this study, to look at these actors, because I think we always thought that there would be by now. We have opera and ballet, but we don't have a national theatre ensemble. So you're right, that is a contrast to today, and it's regrettable.
Yes, and it really removes some of that opportunity, or that kind of opportunity, to both grow as a professional, but also to, again, build that collaborative ensemble experience, which we know historically brought about some of the great theatre experiences of the past, and again, ensemble experiences in long-running television series.
Yes.
Is another form, and those, unless you are able to hook in now to a subscription TV series like we have in the States, are more stronger in that. Again, the actors can miss out on building collaborative relationships and networking and moving from job to job and building ongoing work for themselves and for their peers.
Yes, and some of the actors have also talked about the opportunity to tour, which really built the sense of group cohesion and solidarity. And some of them have talked about how then the production that they did next after a tour together was often, they felt, the best, because they had such a strong sense of collaboration. They knew each other well. There was a sort of level of comfort that allowed for experiment. And so that they also had those wonderful touring opportunities, which were difficult in many ways and very uncomfortable in some ways, in the sorts of spaces they were in, and that they'd be performing so frequently. But it made for very good relationships. So it's very different what those actors experience than at the moment.
I guess though the big, well, one of the lessons is that adaptability. So now, how do actors today adapt when they don't have those kinds of experiences? What are the experiences that will generate the networks, the sense of bonding with others as creative collaborators? What will be the opportunities that they can find?
Well, I think the good process is really, if you haven't got the ensemble and you haven't got long periods together, it's good process, like we were talking about initially, good bonding processes, good opportunities for people to really get comfortable with the text and with each other. Those are the things that have to be really worked on and really solid. And then you can maybe get some of that collaborative work going that you might build if you had longer. But those processes need to be particularly sound and clear and rich. Yeah.
Which makes me think that that's an exciting challenge for all our creative training schools to be nurturing that, not just in the actors, but in all the other professionals that are training alongside them, the directors, the designers, so that it's not left up to the actor to say, I think this would be a good idea if we collaborate.
Yes, definitely. It seems so fundamental, and yet we hear so much that it doesn't always happen. It doesn't work. Yeah.
So we might move from Elspeth to Julia, and what might be, you think, some of the key choices or turning points in her life that informed her process? And again, perhaps give us a little background on what Julia's creative journey has been.
Well, Julia Blake grew up in Bristol, and she came from quite an interesting family of what we call primitive Congregationalists, so quite strict, and they did allow her to do a speech and drama and some dancing, but that was quite unusual in that milieu, I suppose. But she was someone, she expressed very strongly to me how she was drawn to theatre very, very early on, and she would work her way through the local library play section alphabetically, simply reading plays and then doing little performances for herself, really learning lines. So she had a really strong attraction to the theatre and to art, to drawing, to dancing very early on. So when she was able to go to university and do drama and French, she was very, very happy with that. And then, as I said, she went to the Bristol Old Vic. She tried out. I think she had a scholarship. She was obviously considered very, talented. She did that. She learned a lot, gained a lot from that experience. And then she went into rep in the UK. She worked up in Yorkshire. And that's where she met Terry Norris, who was in the company, an Australian, who she married and then came to Australia. So that really was a turning point for her. So her career was only just beginning when she arrived in Australia with Terry, young woman. And he had work in the theatre, and then she also started to get opportunities in Melbourne, and her career took off slowly, I think. But she is somebody who's been in so many films, really iconic films in Australia, as well as having an incredible stage career. And she's somebody who I think the difficulties have been in balancing the work and just the sheer exhaustion of back-to-back productions, filming schedules with stage seasons. And that has been one of the big challenges for her, which she seems to have managed with great flair and good humour and success. So that's her in a nutshell.
Yeah, that's lovely. Yeah, I guess one of the things that I'm interested in, it's often said that family life is identified as a particular price to be paid in the pursuit of an artistic career. However, it often seems more costly for women than for men. And I was wondering if they might like to share something of Julia's choices around raising a family and its impact, and how that might also impact on men, her husband being an actor as well.
Well, Julia was very interesting. She had 3 children, and she said to me that one of the great things was that she sort of turned to motherhood knowing that she wouldn't be able to combine it well with acting. So she felt that in a way there was some relief in that she could have breaks, that she knew she could just turn to it, and it was a break that got her away from the obsessiveness of acting that she noticed in herself. So in a way, it was this whole other life that she embraced. She knew that she couldn't do the 2 of them, so she just took long breaks. So I think that was the way she dealt with it. Later, it did become difficult, of course, with teenagers, and her husband became a member of state parliament in Victoria. Of course, their household was extremely busy. He was also an actor for many years and still is. So they were combining these 2 careers. But she did sort of know herself well enough to say, well, I can't do both at the same time. I will enjoy the busyness of motherhood. So she didn't sort of see it as a cost necessarily at the time. Mm. It was quite an insight into her personality, I thought, that she expressed.
And there we've looked at women like Julia and like Elspeth, and one hopes we would appreciate and understand the demands and the appropriate response to motherhood and the way that each of them negotiated it in their own way with their own particular circumstances. I wondered if the question of family featured as much when you were interviewing male actors. Did it feature? Was it something they didn't talk about unless it was initiated from you? Or I'd be interested to know if there was a difference, or for them it was as much a challenge, because we might think that it's seen as a woman's issue, family, rather than a man's issue.
Yeah, no, they did talk about it, but probably not in quite so much depth, and it didn't become so much of a theme, though a lot of the men talked about the difficulties of small children being out of the house. They did find that difficult, and on tour, being away from children, and feeling that disconnection. So they did discuss it, and they did feel it. I suppose it just didn't dominate their consciousness as much as some of the women who just found it all encompassing and felt they had to withdraw at some level, simply to survive and to do the job of mothering, even if it was for a short period, temporary period. But certainly the men in the study have mentioned the pressures, and the pressures on their partner and the difficulties of that, especially if they're both in the theatre, that they do talk about it, and the decisions they've made that have been really difficult, and also marriages that have broken down. So all of that does come into the interviews. It was just particularly salient for these two women, I think. There are also women who haven't married, so their careers have been very different or haven't had children. But, yeah, I hope that answers the question.
Yeah.
I don't want to make too stark a difference, but these two actresses really, really did find it difficult in some ways, but found ways of coping that I think are really inspiring.
Which is great, because there again we've got that uninhibitedness about sharing the ups and the downs of the process, and finding a strategic and creative way through for each of them. Whether it's stepping back or shifting the work so that it accommodates the reality of being a full human being, rather than just a tool or an instrument for a production company. I think that's an important distinction. Yeah. Yes. So you also locate a question of an obsession to perfectionism. Is this a theme that's surfaced among the actors you've interviewed? And do you see any alternative ways to address this for a healthier lifestyle? Because you can get you spoke of Julia becoming very aware of her own obsessiveness around performance and being perfect, no doubt about it.
Yes, and this, I think, was a stress for her real sense of wanting to excel, so that it was sort of driving and it became a real pressure and a real problem at one point in her career. But she also talks about it being a two-sided thing, that is wanting to be your best, do your best and immerse yourself in it, was also the pleasure and the strength of her as an actor. That she enjoyed every minute of it. She enjoyed it so much, but then it could sometimes become too obsessive. So yeah, she really talked about that at length and found a way through it at last. Other actors also talk about it and deal with it differently. I think for some actors, the sort of sense of self-doubt has been at times crippling, but they have overcome it, obviously. But yes, it is always a problem, and especially when you're under pressure going from one thing to the next, it becomes very stressful. So it has been a theme of the interviews, that sense of really wanting to do everything to make it a good performance every night.
Yes.
And sometimes feeling that you fell short.
What I also appreciated in your chapters, where you have Julia acknowledging that she says how little we know about acting, and this is something you note that she comments on now as a professional with many years' experience. How surprising or significant was it for you to hear her say that?
I thought it was so refreshing and so honest and so right. We'd spent hours talking about acting, and she is very knowledgeable and very, very reflective about acting, about process. She's done so much reading. She is such an accomplished and experienced actor on the stage, on television, on film, that when she came out with it and then laughed, it was a wonderful moment, because it really is so true. I mean, there is still quite a bit of mystery about acting, and so she was acknowledging that we can't know it it all, and that we make steps, but we sometimes feel that we're in the dark about it. I just thought it was a very honest sort of revelation of the truth about acting, as about a lot of art, but particularly about acting.
And I think it's an encouragement for anyone watching that there's always more to acting than we know about it, that it's as a social and artistic skill, that it's an ongoing craft, and it's not like someone finally has it and it's all mastered and under control. So I think that's such a very humble and honest account for Julia to offer us in that way.
Yes, she's very wise. And she has this infectious laugh as well. So she sort of laughed after she said it. And it was a really, really wonderful moment in the interview.
So I think, as we come to the conclusion of our interview, I guess, this whole chapter has been valuable because it's a way in which we, in a sense, we as performers learn from our elders. And I know in my own work with student actors that often the way they seem to be learning, though, is often through Googling their favourite actors and hearing through the internet about their latest family crisis or a stunt that went wrong or some on-set or off-set argument. But that seems to me it's more akin to gossip rather than an informed, ethically shaped biography. I wonder what your thoughts are about that.
Yes, I think while some of that is probably interesting, there's no real way of telling how true those things are and whether they've been written by anyone who actually knows or has any close association or knowledge of the person. So, and they're very ephemeral, those things, and may not even be right or true. So I think there is very much a place for biography, the life interview, where a lot of time is taken to get to know an actor, and they have the opportunity to shape the story at some level, and the work is checked. And I should say that part of the process is I also listen to other interviews, if I can, with actors to try and get a sense of a range of responses at different times in their life. So I really try and verify material. Sometimes I might go back to them and say, you said in 1970 this, what do you think now? So that really is a lot of work goes into this. So I'm hoping that is also a way of learning about an actor's life, a particular actor's life, but also actors' lives more generally, particularly in this period that I'm working in. So I really think there's a lot. I'm a great reader of biography, and I do find it a source of incredible interest and value and wisdom, because usually they're about people who've had a whole career and have a huge amount to offer. So I think there's a huge difference between what you might find about somebody, online, and this kind of much more considered work about a person's life.
So as we wrap up our time together, I'd like to just draw attention to those of you who've been watching this interview today with Anne, that her article, that her chapter in our book about performance, The Lives of Actors, is now available, and you'll find the link to that publication below this webinar if you're viewing this on the website page. So I invite you to click there, and you can order a copy either as a PDF file or as a hard copy, and it's Australian dollars. It's $40 Australian plus postage and handling. So if you'd like to read this chapter in particular, and of course the many other chapters that are in this book, I encourage you to do so. So as we have one more webinar planned for next week, I'll just take this opportunity to finally say, first of all, thank you, Anne, for being a part of this webinar series.
Oh, thank you very much, Mark. It's a pleasure. It's really very interesting, and thanks for inviting me to participate.
I'm so glad we got to see you today when you were not well that other occasion. So it's great to pick it up today. So
thank you for rescheduling the
not a problem. So for all of you watching, as I mentioned, we have another webinar next week where we'll be interviewing, I will be interviewing Jane Griffiths on her experience of the challenges of playing intense dramatic and physically and emotionally dramatic roles. You may recall, if you watched my interview with Cheryl McFarren, she was due to be a fellow interviewee but wasn't able to join us on that occasion, so I'll be interviewing her next week. So as I say, goodbye from me, and encourage you to continue to support us in promoting the health and well-being of actors. I will conclude our webinar today with the slide announcing next week. So until next time, goodbye for me.